Welcome again to everybody to today's commemoration of the Mahasamadhi of Lahiri Mahashaya. And I see many more have joined us since we had our introductory opening. And when we look at the life of Lahiri Mahashaya, he was born in 1828. And think of what life was like in 1828 in India, in America, in Europe. It was a very different world than what it was by the time he passed in 1895. The world had tremendously changed during that period of time. And you could say that it was a special time when change was happening very, very quickly throughout the world. And what you found in 1825, electricity was not common in those days. That was before railroads, before modern transportation. But by the time the Mahashaya passed, a whole different world had come into being, a whole different technology, many different expressions of how energy was going to be used. And it was a time of changing of the ages, as our masters have told us. It was a time when the earth and the whole planet was moving from a dark age into an age of energy. And all of our masters, Babaji, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Paramahansa Yogananda, they had come at a special time to usher in that new age. It was that age that went from Kali to Dwapar, and of those masters, you might say of all of those, the one that was the most transitional, I think, of those four particularly, was Lahiri Mahashaya, because he definitely had come into a time before the modern, what we now consider the modern world. He had come into this world at that time, but yet by the time he exited this world, this modern age that we consider the world of technology and all the changes that were brought about in that second half of that 19th century were starting to insert themselves into everyday life throughout the world. But that was simply the outer change that was happening. There was also a change of energy that had come into the world, that things were changing on all different levels, socially, technologically, but also spiritually as well, at least in terms of how spirituality was expressed. And so Lahiri Mahashaya was, you could say, that a transitional figure. And he had been incarnated specifically to introduce a new wave of energy into the world that would be followed up upon by the subsequent masters of Sri Yukteswar and of our guru, Paramahansa Yogananda. He brought in, you could say, that new introduction of certain principles that were going to break from the past and be introduced into the future. And of particularly, he brought in in spirituality, he brought in a new attitude of what it meant to be spiritual in this world. Now, it was, if you read the autobiography of a yogi, we see that he was introduced he discovered his guru, Babaji, at the age of 33. And that was for a purpose. There's a meaning to that, to why is so often is the case. Many people come to their guru at a young age, but he did come to his guru and he was not awakened into the greatness of his own past lives by Babaji until he was fully established in his career. He was fully established as a householder. He had a family at that time. He had a career as an accountant. And we know the story of him being called up, transferred up into Ranikhet, and where he meets his guru Babaji, and he's awakened. We could say reawakened, maybe is a better way to say that. He was reawakened to the greatness of his own being from past lifetimes by Babaji. And he, in that meeting, he wanted very desperately, as we've all read, he wanted very desperately to stay with Babaji in Himalayas. But Babaji specifically had called him at that time when he was already established. He said, no, your duty is in the world. Your duty is to go back, take up your profession, take up your life as a householder, and introduce into this world these teachings that have been passed down to you, these teachings of Kriya Yoga. And this is what Lahiri Mahashaya did. And it was his duty to show the world that one could be in the world, but not of the world. And that was what Lahiri, that was you could say, the expression of Lahiri's life. Now, as the years have passed, and when people speak of Lahiri Mahashaya, they often make much of the fact that he was a householder. And in those days, of course, much more so probably than now, the idea of being a yogi, of being somebody who is going to be a great spiritual saint, the expectations, you might say, was that you might renounce the world outwardly, take up the path of, a monastic perhaps, somewhat retreat from the world. But this was exactly the opposite of what Lahiri Mahashaya was in his daily life, because he was living a very quote unquote normal life. And this was something that he stressed, and it was something that there was a purpose to that. Not, of course, just to give an example of how we could all, in this modern age that we in, that yoga was for everybody, spirituality was from everybody, that householders too could be great saints. It wasn't just for that. It was because he was demonstrating a principle that people had defined spirituality, people had defined religion in outward ways. And to be religious meant doing certain practices, certain ceremonies, certain rituals that had to be done. And what he was saying, that those are perfectly appropriate to be done, but they do not define. And the concomitant to that was, if you wanted to be spiritual, one had to somehow change outwardly. And it goes along with this general theme that is still with us in our minds, that if you want to seek happiness, if you want to seek spirituality, you have to do something different. That happiness is out there somewhere, joy is out there somewhere, God is outside of ourselves, and we have to change our circumstances in order to find God. And Lahiri Mahashaya came to break that thought, and demonstrating it through his own life. And he showed that, and the essence of his teachings was that we need not change. We can be a householder, we can be a businessman, we can be a school teacher, we can be a monastic, whatever it is, but we can do it, and we should do it as a yogi. So Lahiri Mahashaya, yes, he was a householder, but he wasn't a householder. That wasn't his first self-identity. He was a yogi who happened to be a family man. And I think in the age, because we're transitioning, people make much of the fact, oh, he was a householder. In years to come, it will just hardly be remarked upon at all, because what we are outwardly is not the definition of who we are. How we behave out, or what we wear, you might say, outwardly, our costume outwardly, is not the definition of our spiritual status. He was a man who said, be who you are. But he would often say, he says, the Hindu should meditate 4 times a day. The Muslim should do namaz 4 times a day. The Christian should do prayers 4 times a day. The yogi, of course, the Kriya yogi needs to do your yoga, do your practice, do your meditations, do them regularly. He would say 4 times a day. But it doesn't matter what the outward form is. Each of us, through our own individual religion, can find what we are seeking. We can express spirituality through whatever our outward form is, but do it as a yogi. And his was the direct path to God, the direct path of spirituality, which meant not relying or depending upon the outward trappings of one's religion, the ceremonies or the rituals or the behaviors, because those are indirect. They're good things to do, but they indirectly induce a spiritual upliftment of our consciousness. And what we want to do is we want to directly induce that upliftment of consciousness, whatever our outward path, and that to do that and for that is what he introduced into the world of Kriya Yoga, the teachings of Kriya Yoga, which can be applied to anybody, whatever their outward circumstances, whatever their outward ritual or their outward philosophy. So he came to introduce those techniques of yoga to synthesize, you might say, to synthesize those teachings of yoga that have been passed down, the essence of yoga that have been passed down into a transmissible system of practice, which has been passed down to us now as the science of Kriya Yoga. And this was Lahiri Mahashaya's role, that he was the one chosen to introduce those topics into the world. Somebody needs to mute out there, so it's getting feedback. Now, this idea, I want to come back to this idea of people have this idea of needing to change circumstances in order to, if they want to change their consciousness, that I need to do something outward. And there's a good story related to the life of Sister Gyanamata. And she made a very perceptive observation. He said, if you cannot find God in the circumstances in which God has placed you, where do you expect to find him? You see, you could say, because the circumstances in which we are in are the ones that God has given us in order to use as our personal testing ground to overcome the karma, to overcome those challenges that we had. And within that, that's, you could say, our sadhana is to overcome the situations or to spiritualize the situations in which we find ourselves. You remember, and this is a theme that runs through the lives of our masters. Remember when Master was a boy, he in his own mind identified spirituality, and perhaps it was probably because of past samskars. He wanted to go to the Himalayas. And he identified that is what a yogi does. That's what how a yogi should be. So he longed to go to the Himalayas. And he went, and finally he visited the sleepless saint, Ram Gopal Muzumdar. And in that meeting with him, it's a wonderful chapter in the autobiography of a yogi. He had this wonderful experience, and Ram Gopal advised him. He says, you've run away pretty much from your guru up into these mountains. He says, don't you have in your home, isn't there a place in your home where you can sit aside and just be by yourself, be alone, and worship God? And Master said, yes. He had a little room up in the attic room. He says, yes, I do. I have a little room. And Ram Gopal told him, he says, there is your cave. That is your sacred mountain. In other words, you don't have to go to the other side of the world. You don't have to go far away. Where you are right now is the circumstances that have been given to you. Spiritualize or make those circumstances in a way that allows you to go within yourself and to be able to change from within. And this was the message of Lahiri Mahashaya. He said, solve all your problems with Kriya Yoga. And of course, think about that. We think we have problems, we need to do something about those problems, and we immediately approach our problems, our approach to life outwardly, from our outward, an outward approach to it. But he was saying, don't approach your problems outwardly, trying to immediately go to solving intellectually, you might say, approaching the answers to your problems in life. Approach it from within. Change your consciousness. It's what Lahiri Mahashaya was saying. Change your consciousness, and in the process of changing your consciousness, everything outside of yourself will begin to conform. And this is such a basic truth of spirituality. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these other things will be added unto you. When you go within to seek God within and apply that consciousness to your daily life, you find that the world around you conforms. It's because the magnetism, your own magnetism, draws to you the solutions to the problems that sometimes you don't even know you have because they're on a subconscious level. But you begin to attract to yourself those things that you need by changing within. And of course, he gave the techniques of Kriya for us to be able to daily, in our little cave that each one of us have in our own lives, is to daily practice of Kriya Yoga, the consciousness begins to change. And this was a very different, now we approach to religion. Now we take this somewhat for granted, that of course, this is what we have to do as Kriya Yogis. It seems quite natural, but still, we look at religion, and there's still, even in our day and age, the outward approach, ceremonies, rituals, outward form, rather than inwardly transforming ourselves. But Lahiri was not adverse. You know, he was saying, change yourself within. That's the most important aspect of what religion is about, not the outward form. But yet, he respected the outward forms. He told people, if you're of one religion or another, do what is appropriate to your religion. And you don't have to change. You don't have to do something else. And there was a wonderful story that I always liked from Lahiri's life, is that he had one devotee, I forget his name, but he had one devotee who was very much attracted to Lahiri, and he was, you could say, he was of temperament that wanted to reject religious forms, outward religion. He wanted he wanted to see beyond that. And so what he did, when he would come to visit, he came to visit Lahiri Mahashaya one time, and he went directly. He got to Varanasi, and he was Benares in those days, and he went directly to Lahiri Mahashaya to take his darshan. He says, "I've come to you, sir, to take your darshan." And Lahiri said, "Well, did you follow the local custom, which wasn't at that time, and perhaps still is, to go to the temple, Vishwanath temple there? If you've been to Varanasi, you know the old traditional main temple there." He says, "Did you go to the Vishwanath temple? And before that even, did you go to the Ganga, the Ganges? Did you take a dip, purify yourself, and then go to the temple, take darshan?" And the disciple, he said, "No, sir, I came directly to you to take darshan from the living Vishwanath." And now that sounded very nice. It sounded, would be attractive, that Lahiri might think that was a good thing. But Lahiri said, "No, you've misunderstood. You need to go and take the dip in the river, go to the Vishwanath temple." But the man said, "I've come to take darshan from the living Vishwanath." And Lahiri dissuaded him. He says, "No, first you follow the custom." So the man, of course, being a disciple, he went. He bathed in the Ganges, and then he went to the temple there, and he went to take darshan of Vishwanath, the Murti there, and he looked at the Murti, And what did he see? It was the image of Lahiri Mahashaya, not of the traditional Vishwanath. It was Lahiri Mahashaya there, and he was aghast. And immediately, Lahiri was just sitting there in his posture. He then understood, and he went to Lahiri, and he took darshan from him then. He did get darshan from the living Vishwanath and say, but it was, and the story is here. The purpose of the story is Lahiri said, be appropriate to whatever is the custom. You don't need to do something other. Do what is appropriate to your station in life. Do what is appropriate, that is your dharma in life. But do it as a yogi. That's what we do. We do it as a yogi. And as a yogi, we then spiritualize. And it's the interchange that is important. Because the thought of changing our circumstances hypnotizes us into the outer world. I need to do this, I need to do that. That's where my happiness lies. I chuckle at myself in this regard because I have a neighbor. And I enjoy the outdoors, and I like to go camping and things like that. And I have a neighbor who's got a very cute little travel trailer. It's a very little small thing. It's very compact and all. It's got all sorts of. It's got a little kitchen in there and a place to sleep. And then you put it on the back of a truck or your car. You can go out and go by the river, the seashore, or wherever. And I walk by this every day, twice a day usually. Twice a day I walk by it and I look at that little thing, and every time I go by, I start thinking, oh, wouldn't that be nice to have that little trailer? Then I could go out, I could be in the forest, I could go out, be by myself, maybe take a day. You get these little fantasies. And I know it's a fantasy. And I know I'd get in that trailer and I'd go out there and I'd be by a campfire and the mosquitoes would be eating me up and I'd be cold at night. And all of these things are the reality. I've done this enough times to know what the reality would be. But there's this little thought in there. Oh, that's the way to happiness. Be out in there in the bliss of nature. Now it isn't. I'm saying that can be nice to do. But happiness is not out there. It's here inside of ourselves. And this is the message that our masters have come. And you could say, it seems very simple and straightforward and basic, but there's deep implications of that. Change, the kingdom of God is within us. That's where we're going to find our happiness. That's where we're going to find God, not running elsewhere. And each of us in our own way have been landed in the situation in which we find ourselves because of our particular karma. That is the field of Kurukshetra in which we are doing our battle with the forces of the opposition. Now, that brings me to a thought. It was in the latter part of the 19th century in India at that time, there was a Renaissance. And some people call it the Bengal Renaissance, but it was basically something throughout the country. An intellectual renaissance took place where there was a flowering of intellectual approaches to the modern life, that life was changing, everything was changing. It was this transitional time, and India was responding to that on many different levels, artistically, but also spiritually. And in literature, it was also, and this is when at a time when, although the Bhagavad Gita was well-known scripture, been passed down for a long time, and centuries and millennia perhaps, but yet it was not known in use as commonly as it is now in India. Everybody knows the Gita, and of course, that wouldn't have been said at that time. But at that time, there was a renaissance at that time to bring to the common public the teachings of the Gita. And Lahiri Mahashaya was one of the players in that, not by himself, others as well. There were many. There was you might say, there was an incarnation, a descent of many, many great souls and saints at that time that had come into the world, and the flowering of the Gita took place. But Lahiri brought something very special, because he was the one who brought out to the public at large the symbolism of the Gita that has now been passed down to us in Sri Yukteswar, and the way that the Gita is interpreted as each of those characters representing qualities within each one of us. And that battlefield of Kurukshetra is the battlefield that each of us find ourselves in. And that battlefield for each one of us is unique. Lahiri Mahashaya was universal. In other words, say there's a universality and a commonality to all religious traditions. True religions have the same inward purpose. But each of us uniquely or no two saints or no two souls are ever going to be alike. We each have our individual awakening to stimulate. Each of us, as Master said, each individual going to a church is good, but you're not going to find your salvation by going to a church or going to a temple. Each individual must make personal love to God and have that relationship. So we're each unique in that way. But Lahiri Mahashaya also showed that we're not unique. We're all common in that there's only one pathway to God. Outwardly, there are many religions, but inwardly, there's that pathway of the inner spine, the pathway of awakening from subconsciousness to consciousness to superconscious that takes place within us. And that inner anatomy of awakening is what Lahiri Mahashaya said. Each of us have the responsibility of taking up our staff and walking that path. But take the tools that have been handed down from ancient times to practice. And that's the teachings of Kriya Yoga. And he introduced these, he brought into the world in that little room. If those of you who've been to Varanasi, take pilgrimage there to Lahiri's home, in the sitting room there, not very large, maybe you could fit 12 people in there. And from that little sitting room, saints came to Lahiri like bees coming to honey. He didn't go out. His practice was he would develop within himself the magnetism to attract the bees to that honey. And bees came from throughout India to sit at his feet. And from that satsang with their guru, those teachings of Kriya Yoga went out north, south, east, and west, and have now traversed all countries and all lands. These teachings of Kriya Yoga have reached out throughout the world. And this was a divine destiny that Lahiri Mahashaya was an instigator of, given to him through Babaji, but also something that he predicted. You read in the autobiography of a yogi that he said, 50 years will come after my passing. My life will be written. And others will tell of my life. In his life, very few people actually knew about him. Great saints, of course, they knew. But the general public, he was unknown. But he predicted 50 years will pass, and then my life will be written. And that task, that prediction was made true through our guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, who wrote in the autobiography and revealed, you might say, publicly for the first time to the world the great life and the great soul that was Lahiri Mahashaya, who you could say set the ball in motion and has been passed down. This tradition has been passed down to us. So we commemorate that. We commemorate the but we see the changes that have taken place since in Lahiri's life, and we see the changes that have taken place outwardly after his life. And we realize that now we have been given, all of us, a great gift. That gift of his legacy that has been passed down to the great disciples of Lahiri Mahashaya through Sri Yukteswar to our Guru Paramahansa Yogananda. And we've been given the tools to have a direct experience. The direct religion is, or the direct approach to God is what Lahiri Mahashaya practiced and what he taught. This is, you could say, the memory or the legacy of Lahiri Mahashaya, which continues to grow and spread to people throughout the world. So it's our, you could say, it's our duty as disciples of this legacy to be instruments for that and to carry on that legacy. But Lahiri Mahashaya was not so much for outward display. He was not particularly interested in organizations. In fact, he even dissuaded his disciples from having organizations. It was through the practice and the awakening of individual souls, individually making love to God, as Master would say. This was going to be the mechanism by which this message of Kriya Yoga would ultimately be spread throughout the world. One soul awakening and then passing that legacy on to another soul and another soul. And so we can participate in that by being instruments, awakening ourselves to that light of the great ones, and then sharing that message with others. And in this way, we are blessed by being instruments of this message of Lahiri Mahashaya. And so